I wanted to thank Trelor and all of the organizers for putting this together in this wonderful celebration of Lindenmeier here in Fort Collins, and I feel very honored to have been invited and very pleased to be here, and I thank all the audience for their interest and shared interest in Folsom that I also share with you. And to take this opportunity to look at Folsom as it's being expressed in the southern part of the state. We're looking south here at the San Luis Valley and its border, of course, with New Mexico. On the east side, we have the Sangre de Cristo Mountains with many, many peaks that go up to 14,000 feet. And then bordering on the west is this beautiful San Juans, from which the Rio Grande River flows and begins its trek down to the Gulf of Mexico. The Cattle Guard site is located here, pretty close to Great Sand Dunes National Monument. This northern part of the basin, north of the Rio Grande, is internally drained. And so at the time of Folsom and during many wet periods, which would include Cody and other times more recently, from sort of this vantage point, you would have looked down at that valley and it would have been a glimmering sea of lakes, ponds, and marshes during Folsom times. And here we're on the Sangres looking west toward the San Juan Mountains. And the last of the remaining large natural lakes, it has artificially held water levels at this time, but it did start as a natural basin lake, is San Luis Lake there at the blue dot, and a photograph of that lovely location. And it's fed by springs that flow into it from Big Spring Creek. This is wonderful buffalo country today, and they have large herds that have been in place on the east side of the valley since at least 1985. So we had the great pleasure of being able to excavate their ancestors when they would come to visit us and watch us do that. It was pretty interesting in 1985. The Cattle Guard, this is the location of another small lake known as Head Lake. We worked with a team from the University of Arizona to try to understand how climate change has affected the valley through time, and took sediment cores out of both San Luis Lake and Head Lake, and also on Como Lake above, right at about upper tree line on Sierra Blanca. And as an aside, that particular mountain is held sacred by the Dene as their sacred mountain to the east, the mountain that we call Mount Blanca. And from that we see, as things get warm and dry, of course, the trees move up slope, and then as it cools off, they move down slope. A lot of our pollen cores are very similar to those taken by Linda Scott Cummings and others throughout the state. And this is the location of Cattle Guard, which sits about midway between the wetland systems and the Sangre de Cristo Mountains. This is the Cattle Guard locality. It's in a wind deflation blowout that was active in 1977. It's fairly stabilized is too strong a word perhaps, but we have slowed down the erosion there, even through the droughts of the last decade. In 1977, Dennis was studying private collections, and he came across this base that was in the collection of Mrs. Duane Martin, who had passed away, but her husband happened to remember where that it was found, and was kind enough to take Dennis to that locality. All across the surface of the blow was tooth enamel, small bone fragments, channel flakes, small flakes, Folsom projectile point fragments. And so it looked at that time as if this was a completely deflated setting. About 5 years in, Dennis would continue to return there for surface collections, and then in 1981 the decision was made to do testing there to pull together a comparative collection of raw materials being used in the valley that would also be meaningful for technological studies as well. It was being heavily collected by avocationals as well, who of course knew the site locality. These are the complete projectile points. Most of these are excavated from the site. When they went in 1981, to everyone's delight and surprise, there was a buried, articulated bone, buried about 40 to 45 centimeters at that time below ground surface. So in 1983, Dennis Stanford invited me to come there to resume testing for my master's thesis, which I did. Since 1981 and through 1996, there have been 13 seasons of excavation at Cattle Guard for a total of 1,586 square meters excavated. The main block that you see here is a maximum of 74 meters north-south by 34 meters east-west. And the east block is 132 meters square with a maximum of 10 meters north-south and 20 east-west. And then there's a series of smaller isolated 2 by 2 meter test pits that aren't shown here. This is the current buffalo herd that are residing in the valley. I chose this particular shot because there happens to be about 49 animals in it, which are the number of animals that we can account for in our present excavations at Cattle Guard. So this gives you some idea of the size of the herd. This is also a cow-calf herd, which was the composition of the herd that they were hunting in the late summer, early fall. And we know that from the eruption patterns of the mandibles. And in fact, George Friesen had helped me with that, and they pioneered those techniques up in Wyoming. We have a very small sample, but it is consistent. So at this particular locality, it's to no one's surprise, with that much work on hand and that many animals on the ground, that they set up the camp right there. And we sort of take that for granted nowadays, but actually when we dug Cattle Guard, it was the first time that we actually had the kill in the camp in a late summer, early fall kill. And I remember when I'd go to meetings at SA, people would come up to ask me, was I working on a kill site and was I working on a campsite? And the answer became yes to both of those. But it's not really much of a surprise if you think about it, because you're not going to move that amount of animals, so surely you were going to camp fairly close by while you're conducting that work. I think that after the work was completed, the work of, I believe they're drying meat there and working on the hides. There's good evidence for that. And after that work is done, I think that they would have moved to another locality, because you have serious predators on that landscape in the San Luis Valley and elsewhere. This is an example of Arctodus, the short-faced bear, who was a resident of the San Luis Valley, as was the dire wolf, as were large cats. And so this was a scale that a museum had done to show you the relative size of that bear, that Pleistocene bear, relative to humans. And as we all know, bears, all who live here in Colorado are familiar that if you try sticking one bison, on your backyard and see how long it takes the bears to come sniffing around and see what's to eat. They certainly do that at our cabin down in Alamosa. So there are all these kinds of endless, places to camp that are beautiful in the San Luis Valley. And right, within 4 miles of the site itself, there are beautiful springs and lovely creeks and wooded areas. And so I think that there's a good possibility that they would have moved fairly quickly after the work was accomplished, and that this was a fairly short-term camp. One of the reasons that the signals that we have that this was a single occupation is that the bone has a consistent weathering pattern from one end of the site to the other. On the top, you see the groundward bone is fairly well protected. It has a limonite manganese coating on it from precipitates out of the groundwater. What grut marks we have been able to find at the site are on those preserved undersurfaces. The skyward surface, on the other hand, it's a seriously subaerial weathered. It's root acid etched, deep desiccation cracking. You're typically missing, portions of the cylinder that fragment and start to move out away from the main bone. This weathering pattern goes throughout the entire excavation. There's a single species represented with one season of kill, and there's not ancillary hunting going on. There's not antelope coming in, for instance, along with these other animals. In some portions of the site, the bison bone level is buried by about 50 centimeters. At other places, it's near surface. In the kill area, for instance, it's at surface down to about 10 centimeters below. We are very fortunate to be able to work here before the wind did indeed take it away, out of our chance to learn from that. So the bison bone, because of its weathering pattern, appears to have been positionally stable, relatively speaking, on the surface prior to burial, and that burial took place relatively quickly, I would say, based on the sharpness of the stone tools. Lying amongst that, the buffalo bone are the larger tools like hammerstone anvil, bone cracking equipment, large flake knives, this sorts of things. As the tools get smaller, they move upward and downward in the profile, but by and large, there's a U-shaped curve coincident with the bone level. Same with the flakes. About 90% of the flake assemblage is smaller than your little fingernail. They're coming into the San Luis Valley with raw materials from elsewhere because in the San Luis Valley, the quality of the chip stone that they like to use is not necessarily available there. There's a lot of material that they're able to use for their bone cracking equipment, but they were hauling in with them, backpacker style, the other chip stone material. So I'm going to run through a few of the lines of evidence that we're using and then just launch into interpretations, but to give you an idea of what we looked at to come up with our reasoned suggestions of what might be occurring at cattle guard. So one of the first things, of course, we started with was to plot everything out and to look at the piece-plotted bison bone distribution and just use simple visual inspection as a starting place, as along with the artifacts. But as you can see to the right, when you plot all of the artifacts in one activity area, it gets pretty crowded pretty fast, and it's not immediately, to me, understandable exactly what's going on there. And so we looked, we used techniques that others had used before us very successfully, including density contouring of the bone and the lithics. And they have very complementary, not isomorphic patterns at cattle guard. And then we use k-means cluster analysis to get some idea of how many of the clusters that do show up in the density contours may relate to each other. Were we looking at it at the right scale, for instance? Because we had 8 or 9 of these concentrations. Is that the level at which we should look at it? We looked at it at a whole variety of levels with k-means. And I settled on this particular grouping because it seemed to be meaningful culturally. As I'll walk you through the other kinds of things that we found, it was helpful for me to understand what was some of the things we were able to learn. We were also able to have looked at 160 of the artifacts from cattle guard with use-wear specialists. I've had them all under the microscope, but I think that I was very pleased that Marvin Kay was able to look at a good number of them, as was Stan Ayler and John Tomenchuk. These particular photographs are the micrographs that Marvin Kay made for the tools. This is an early, this is a graphic made at the time of my master's thesis when this was the portion we had open as of 1983, but it sort of simplifies things to a certain degree, where you can see overlapping one another the bison bone density concentrations, tool concentrations, and flake concentrations to the left, with refits as they stood at that time to the right. The haars, just like at Barker Gulch and a lot of Folsom sites, are not preserved at cattle guard. Cattle guard in the Folsom deposits, it was buried by windblown deposits, but the natural lamina that you have in the younger deposits, the last 2,000 years in those sand sheets, are absent in the Folsom level because insects have come in there, and wolf spiders and sand wasps, and they've riddled in there, and you can't find a quarter-size piece in the profile that doesn't have a filled insect burrow in it. Now, the first season I was there, I looked at that and I thought, well, I wanted to work on site structure, and I thought, well, this isn't happening, But I was wrong about that. And one of the things that I learned was actually wolf spiders and a lot of these insects, they secrete a sticky substance from their mouth that keeps the walls of their burrow open while they're using it in these loose sands. And that structure that for thousands and thousands and thousands of years is being overlain into these sands actually creates what's a fragile but yet resistant lacework structure within those sands, which actually held things from just wantonly moving within the sand, which I thought was interesting. This is one of the refits at the site, one of the beautiful, it's got butchering use wear on it, and one of the resharpening flakes from that tool. These are the locations, the same as at Barker Gulch. We were looking at making counts of small calcined pieces of bone that were picked up on the 1/8-inch screens, as well as burn flakes, and trying to reconstruct and infer where the haars had been. And that where these locations are, you see here as red. Now down in at the southern end of the main block is a kill and initial butchery area. And in this area we found this tip of this Folsom Point that fits to a base that was carried back toward K3, which, as you'll see in a little bit, is a place where we've recognized where there's a former tent, well, I would call it a tent location, structure, house, whatever term you want to use. I tend to visualize them in maybe hide-covered, smaller versions of, not big teepees, they don't have the horse, but a dome version more on the order of a size of a sweat lodge is what I'm kind of envisioning. And here's another one that was found close to the first with the base section carried up into that K6 cluster. Another one with the very tip of the projectile point found by the other two, and the base carried up further. And then again, a small section of a midsection that was left in the kill, and a small section toward the tip was carried into K5. I think we see a lot of these small little pieces moving, and I think, as others have suggested before me, I would throw in with that I think they're moving in the meat as they're transporting it around. I'm currently working full-time on finishing the analysis of the flakes in the bone in the northern part of the main block as well as in the eastern block. There's 1,730 bones that we're looking at, and I'm working with 3 wonderful young students who've just graduated from undergraduate work, and they're taking a year off before they go to graduate school, and I'm really lucky to have them help me. There are 784 bones in the section of the kill area that we were able to look at. And here you see Eldon Yellowhorn, who's a First Nations archaeologist and friend from British Columbia who was working with us in 1988. He's standing by a series of the disarticulated limb bones, and then the arrow points to their map position at the site. The kill area has the kinds of bones that you see often in kill areas, those lower limb elements, particularly hind limbs, that have little meat and marrow utility. The highest number of articulations at the site are down there, as one might expect as well. These are the point tips that were found in the kill, and the bases and fragments, and 2 complete projectile points, and a portion of a utilized flake that was refitted from 3 pieces. It's made out of Edwards Plateau chert. And you see that assemblage again here against the wider distribution of the bison bone. When these bison bone distributions come on the screen, you'll observe those various blank areas. In those, I think we're working with 2 hypotheses actually right now. One, in some areas that you could have hides laid out on the ground. Some of them are a suitable size, and they could be working around them. Another one, I'm almost sure that some of these are structures. And so we're beginning to use ring and sector analysis to look at the piece-plotted bone distribution and see what kind of patterning we can find there using that particular technique. And these are some of the tibiotarsal lower hind limb articulations from the kill. And then in this center photograph, that's actually a pelvis bone with a portion of the lumbar and the sacrum. It gives you some idea of, we have the bone, but it's only partially there, which makes faunal analysis a slow but rewarding process. Which I'm talking one of the students into when she looks at it and goes, oh my God, what are we gonna do? But you actually can figure, you can make element IDs, but it's labor intensive to do so, but it's well worth the effort. And so we make the effort to do that, and we are doing a lot of heavy refitting on the bone assemblage itself so that we don't end up with 150 long bone shank fragments as opposed to a humerus, proximal humerus, or something like that. This is Barbara Munford and Pete Arena. This to show you the condition again of bone in the kill area. She's digging near surface where we've actually backfilled. What you see behind her are formerly excavated units with backfilled sand within them. And then she's working right on the edge with that. One of the ways that sand is not as, everybody says sand must be so easy to dig in. And my response to that is you must never have dug in sand, And it's wonderful to screen, I must say. And the artifacts come out clean, you don't have to wash them. This is all marvelous. But to keep those pedestals like that in these Aeolian sands, it's a tribute to the crew that they're able to do that. You have to step very far away from the walls. It's a fragile environment. These are the flake density contours in the kill, with the purple being the highest density of flakes. And the right and left, astragalus, which is the very dense element that's giving us the count on animals, and there are 14 animals represented in this portion of the kill, and there were minimum number of 15 projectile points in this same area. This is part of the natural herd, about a mile from the site. A hide working area is located 8 meters away. And hide working, of course, starts with fleshing. As you see this native grandmother using a fleshing tool. And you see here on the left a tool being used by a friend of mine who's a professional hide tanner, or was at that time, David Christensen from Big Timber, Montana. And this is his tool, chisel flesher, made out of an elk long bone that he uses for bison and elk. And he came and worked with me for a week at the Smithsonian to help educate me about hide working, and worked with me on some of the materials from cattle guard. So much of what I tell you right now, it benefits from the fact that he was willing to take me under his wing and help me try to figure things out that I knew very little about at the time, other than what I read in Plains Anthropologist, which was helpful to a point. And on the right, what you see is a cast of that chisel flesher that was found by an avocational at the Agate Basin site. It's thought to be Folsom. It probably is likely to be Paleo-Indian for sure. And it's made out of a bison tibia. David had me to understand that it is his strong feeling that no one who worked on buffalo hides and worked on moose hides and elk hides didn't come up with this tool through time. That being able to scrape hides with stone scrapers in the early part of the fleshing work only works if you have deer size and antelope down and smaller. But for buffalo, he said that you'd be a crazy person if you didn't have a chisel flesher. Once they remove that flesh and grease, which apparently if you don't take off the hide very quickly, will burn holes and weaken your hide itself. So there's time pressure as much to get the meat on the drying rack as there is to stabilize the hide. So once the fleshing is done, because bison hide has a certain thickness to it, you will come in with these stone tools, often, at least in historic times, in handles. These handles were often handed down in female lines from, grandmother to mother to daughters, and were heirlooms. So this portion of, because buffalo hide is thicker, you need to come in with the end scrapers after the fleshing and continue to move to thin and grain the flesh side of the hide. If you're also taking the hair off and using the hide as leather as opposed to a robe, then you have to, of course, flip it over and do that work again. This part of the scraping of the hides, this early stage graining and scraping, creates the largest creates more end scraper attrition and resharpening flakes than any other part of the process of tanning. These are end scrapers from the site. At the upper right, you see a low 40 power magnified view of the end of that end scraper that was taken by Stan Ayler. Stan Ayler and I we got to talking about, David Christensen pointed something out to me that I hadn't realized. You often hold ideas and you don't even realize that you hold them. And he said, when I listened to you talk, I realized that you seem to think that they did all of the hide work, they finished all the hides there at cattle guard. And I don't think I'd ever explicitly really thought it through as carefully as it needed to be done. And I said, well, I don't know, I guess so. And he said, well, I don't think they're doing that at all. And so what he said is he explained to me that once you do the initial graining and fleshing, and in many places during the summer and late summer, for instance, on the Southern Plains, that's the season when the Kiowa take leather to make tents, and they make teepee covers every year. Some groups would make teepee covers every other year, but you're running through a fair bit of leather. And I think that that's what they're doing at cattle guard also, and that comes not just from the ethnographic record, but it comes directly from the end scrapers themselves. And so I took that idea and I went to Stan Ayler with it. We were working together up at Black Mountain. And he was saying, well, we could test that out because I've got 140 end scrapers from 10 late prehistoric Plains Village sites that I've already studied, and then we could study a sample of the cattle guard once and compare them, because in the Plains Village they were doing all the different stages of hide reduction. And so he looked at all of those, and sure enough, there's a big difference between cattle guard and the Plains Village sites, which you see in the cattle guard assemblage in the use where looked at both at high power by Marvin Kaye and also at low power by Stan, was that you get the early stages of when the hide is wet, as Stan would call it, or soft hide wear, as Marvin Kaye would use his terminology. But in either way, the early stage of hide working represented. And so it's interesting because as I read the wonderful book that Jack Brink just put out on Head Smashed In, which if you haven't seen it, it's just a marvel. Please, look for it. Written for all of us in understandable language with beautiful, beautiful photographs. And so as he talks about it from their point of view up in southern Canada, the late summer, early fall, particularly early fall, the bison skin is getting thick already in that northern country. So they take hides for leather hunts in the spring and very early summer. So they have different seasonality than is being described in the ethnographic records coming out of the southern plains. So I got to thinking about that because people were coming to me and they were saying, well, I read that in your dissertation that you think that it's a leather hunt, and it can't be because they don't do that, at that season because yada, yada. Well, I think everybody might be a little right and a little wrong on that. And one thing about it is that during the younger dryas, when it was cooler, and we don't really understand the seasonality between spring, summer, and fall for Folsom times, I don't believe. And so it's kind of an open question, actually, how the Folsom bison was responding to its environment, and then at what part of its range. Whether you're up in northern Canada is going to make a big difference on whether you're down in South Texas. And so the beautiful thing about use wear on the hide scrapers is that it allows us to let the archaeological record speak to it directly, and that's helpful as well. These are additional tools to the end scrapers that are coming out of that work area. The broken largest tool that you see there is the ultra-thin biface, as I think Stan Ayler named that tool type. It's a very thin knife that I tend to think of as a woman's knife. I tend to think that it was designed and intended to be a specialized knife for thin cutting meat to put them up on the drying rack. And these particular knives, you don't find them in kill areas. To my knowledge, I don't believe we've found any of them in kill areas yet for Folsom, even though a number of kill areas have been excavated. Instead, what we tend to find in kill areas, if you get the butchering tools, are those beautiful unifacial knives that are in the record early to late. They're very effective tools for that. This particular tool, my flint knapper friends inform me, and Bob Patton's here, and you can see if you still think the same, that this tool is as difficult or more difficult to make, depending on who you talk to, than the Folsom point itself. So they had a serious reason for making this particular tool. Because it's thinner in the center than it is on the edges, it's very susceptible to breakage on torque. And so it's just like a screwdriver. Some tool users will be very careful with their tools, and they're not going to use a screwdriver, if you're a real purist, to open a paint can, which of course I would do in a heartbeat. And so I think it's the same with any kind of tool users. You might have had people that would never subject their ultra-thin to breakage. Of course, they do break. That's why we find them in the sites. But if you take that tool, you're going to put it at risk if you're doing heavy butchering with it. I don't think this was designed for heavy butchering, although you could certainly do it with this tool. No argument. But I think that when I think yearly, they're taking these big kills during Folsom. And they're planning for these kills. And when you have, at least there's several sites where you have upwards of 40 to 50 animals taken in these late summer, early fall kills. When you have all that work to do, you're going to develop efficient tools for that and organized ways to get that work done. And I find it interesting that, for instance, in Texas, if you look at two other time periods when human groups are hunting on a regular, predictable basis, very large herds of animals, they come up with a similar tool. Toya phase, for instance, in the late prehistoric, they've got their diamond-beveled knives, which a lot of other cultural groups share. And then in the late archaic, they come back. And so I think it's just that through time, people figure out what works. If you're not hunting bison on a regular basis, like I say, if you have a big hunt every 5 years, you may or may not choose to have a knife like this. If you have a hunt like this every year, you're going to have a hunt like this, this amount of work is on your plate. I think you do develop a tool like this. And that idea I attribute to Brian Hayden, who discussed this in the Pacific Northwest for fish knives. That if you're not much of a fisherman and you go out, you're lucky you have a knife. If you are a professional fisherman, you might have 3 or 4 knives specialized for the different tasks that are before you. And so when I read that, it just sparked that in me, and I really got to thinking about why are they investing in this very thin, easily breakable, yet valuable tool to them? And I think it's because it's an ideal tool for putting meat up on the rack. So David Christensen had worked with Crow women who taught him how to take a big muscle mass and carve it like an apple, which is what they do, around and around and around. So you end up with a meat that's about this long and this wide and thin. And we think of jerky as the way we buy it now. Not everybody, but I'm just saying a lot of people do. In Washington, D.C., believe me, it's, people think that. And I'm not, it's my home, but I'm saying. I talk to people about this like, really, Yeah, so Crow women were really, really respected. Women who could do that quickly, efficiently, and without holes, and put that up on the rack. That was a skill that is developed from the time that you're little to you're older. And the women respected other women who were capable of those kinds of skills. So I think this tool, some of my Flint Knapper friends were kind enough, actually 5 of them, to make these for me so that I could use them thin cutting meat. And 3 of them were made out of obsidian, and as you might predict, it's not a good substance in that you could get, glass inside jerky. That's no good. But the ones that were made out of chert worked ideally, and so I worked with Bruce Bradley making jerky out of an elk one season. And there's a beautiful tool for that. It has that long edge that they're after, and when you hold that, hand hold it, we have prehensile wear, according to Marvin Kaye, on that knife. So that particular one, he thinks is handheld. I'm not saying they all were, but at any rate, you can use a wrist movement like that and make long cuts, controlled cuts in that thin meat, as opposed to moving the arm. When these break, like this one, for instance, broke at that kill. We've got resharpening flakes, so they were using it there. When it broke, they discarded it. And the same with the one at the bottom. We've got other fragments there. It broke. Both of these tools broke in that camp, and they didn't recover them. And I think they do recover some of them. We have one that was recycled into a saw. These are woodworking tools that you see here, just to give you an idea of some of the other tools. And then in this area that I call the work area, unlike every other part of the residence to the north, every other part of that camp besides the kill, the debris from projectile point production is sort of dominates the assemblage. And in this, it's very much the reverse. What's dominating down here are end scrapers, woodworking tools, a fair amount of woodworking tools, and we have 5 ultra-thin bifaces at the site, and 2 of them are down here in this area. This part of the site is a very small part of the whole, and yet 36% of all of the end scrapers on the site are found down in this area with hide scraping wear on them. This tool right here appears to be a tool that was used in later stages of high production. We don't have a lot of them, but this one was another one that David Christensen pointed out to me. It has just the right edge, and he brought his tools with me. He's got 5 or 6 made out of everything from a china plate to blinders on a mule that have that same convexity and were strong enough that at the latter stages, when the hide has been, the brain solution has been on it, the hide is damp, and then you're doing that pushing that you might have seen in photographs or people actually doing, where they're stretching and softening those hides to make suede as opposed to rawhide. That tool has the use wear on it that suggests it was done for that, and that was the first tool that David picked up and said, if I had to choose anything in this assemblage to use for that job, that would be the tool. And I sent it to the use wear people, and that's the kind of wear it has on it. This particular white ultra-thin biface is been in the toolkit longer than some of the others. It was last used to be cut as a saw. So when people say, well, I have an ultra-thin and it doesn't have butchering wear on it, so they're not meat knives, the next question you should ask them is, was it a recycled tool? Do you think it was still being used for its original purpose? Because that's an important question to ask, because I have ultra-thins also that don't have meat butchering wear on them, but they're recycled tools. And as Stan pointed out on the white tool, he was saying that the unifacial repair and resharpening on that tool he felt was done by somebody who did not have the flint knapping skills of the person who made that tool. This is the bone distribution down in the work area, and these are the refitted artifacts that go along with those black lines that you see. Since this graphic was made, we dug additional squares, and that's where you see it closed off but not shaded in green. So now in this area, K3, where the shaded area is here, is the best evidence, I think, at cattle guard forest structures so far. And it's associated with an outdoor activity area, and there are concentrations of burned lithics and calcined bone in each that suggest both of them were associated with a hearth. And this gives you some idea of not the covering perhaps, but maybe the size and even the scale of maybe some of the wood that you might have. In the absence of horses to transport your the structure for whatever tent that you're using in a mobile situation, I look towards sweat lodges, I think because I've helped build a number of them since 2005 with a man I work with who's a Nuwalit from Greenland. And they're fairly easy to construct. You can use much smaller wood to do it and tie them together at the top. It's more of a suitable size, I would say, for transport, particularly if they don't have dogs, although I think it's quite likely they did have dogs, but still an open question. So this gives you another view. To the right is the bison bone within the house. It's a highly selected subset of the very meaty elements. There's the upper forelimb of the front and back limb are represented there with cut marks and impact marks from taking of the marrow. These are fairly young animals represented in this house. And the lumbar vertebra right around the north end of the house is in there as well. And again, to show you the hearth location. Off to the right here, where you see that blue mark, there's a place where at least 5 new projectile points were manufactured. This is a group of people, Southern youth, that were hired by the Historical Society to portray Native people in a film called Day in the Life of Paleo Indians a decade or so ago. And I was asked to, I was just chatting up the director, and he was telling me that they were supposed to go up to Aspen, but they waited too long and it was hunting season and they weren't sure where they were going to film this. And of course, I love the San Luis Valley, and I said, well, let's go south. We have buffalo, you know. And so we did, and these are these beautiful people hired to portray that, just lovely folks. And Nadine, who's wearing the coyote ruff, who has since passed on, but I have their permission to use these photographs, which I acquired at the time of making the film. So I'm not dishonoring them, but I like to bring the people back into it where it's possible. This, out by the outdoor hearth, there's another ultra-thin that's been burned and exploded from the heat. We don't have all of the pieces represented in it or in our excavation. In this particular scraper was used both inside what I think is a structure as well as in the outdoor activity area. We have resharpening flakes that overlap like shingles, so we know which one came off first and which one came off second. And these are the tools that were found associated with that structure inside, and then as you see the suite of discarded Folsom points as well as manufacturing debris. The Chuska piece, the beautiful pink piece underneath the burned ultra-thin. We have the distal channel flake that fits that preformed tip as well as one of the biface thinning flakes. And it comes from an activity area where there's many, many more of these flakes. Cattle guard to be a place where refitting studies can be done at the Smithsonian long into the future, which is a wonderful thing. One of the things that I was trying to accomplish was figure out if tools were resharpened where we found them discarded. And once I had found a resharpening flake that fit onto an end scraper, I was good to go to find one for another tool. And now we're going back through, and you can, I have no doubt at all that you'll be able to do sequences of resharpening flakes down in that work area. It's there. And so anybody interested in that kind of work, it's a beautiful place to do it because we have at least 12 different kinds of raw materials which give you a leg up when you're doing refitting. These are tools that were found in the outdoor portion, right adjacent to what I think is a tent. And you can see the small fragments that you have there that are typically found close to hearth areas, and as Nicole was saying, around the edges and peripheries of structures. The tool fragments that you see there in the upper left belong to bone cracking equipment and have been refitted to that equipment. The bone cracking equipment It's been really, really informative because they collect it there locally against the slopes of the Sangre de Cristos. Rocky Mountains are well named. They don't need to take it with them. They can get more rocks elsewhere. And so they leave it behind, and it is all left behind, and you can refit it. And it's been more informative in terms of what happened first and what happened sort of sequentially at the camp because all the pieces are there. And so I'm really grateful to those tools. It's kind of funny thing about Folsom, because if people come to the lab, I get really excited, and they're like, whoa, do you want to see the bone cracking equipment? And, I've got like 2 takers in, 10 years. And it's like with all of that, with all the projector points, they're like, you're a crazy woman, And, but I got to say, Josh Boyd, who came from here, is working on end scrapers, was willing to look at that. And I'm proud of him. Like, there's a whole other generation out there. These are the small fragments once again. And now we're just sort of move up through these activity areas to give you an idea of, you begin to see these suites that occur in more than one location where you get bone cracking equipment. In this case, they're nice cobbles, GNEISS. People are saying, like, I just like the cobbles. And on the upper left is a sandstone abrader with red ochre still on it, and it was found with abraded pieces of red ochre all around it. And the next tool, I think I've highlighted it. This is a hammerstone for making projectile points, and this was pointed out to me by J.B. Sahlberger. Sounds like I don't have any original ideas, but I actually do. But I'm a big believer in remembering where you heard something and giving credit for it. And so I like to thank the people who have helped me along the way. He said that this particular grade is like a sugar sandstone. As he called it, he said he thought it was a dandy hammerstone for Folsom people because it grips the edge in a particular way. And I looked at that tool, and there's a lot of abrasion on it, and I hadn't recognized it for what it was at that time. In my 20s when I first started working, first season at Cattle Guard. So once again, you see the suite of channel flakes and preforms where you can account for at least 5, a minimum number of 5 new points made in this particular locality. We replicated a number of these hammerstone anvil tools and butchered 2 buffalo and harvested the bones from it and did bone cracking experiments to see how it worked. Because Rob Bonnickson and I were working together to try to understand, and I kept showing him my bone cracking equipment and the anvils that are all packed. And he kept saying, no, I'm breaking all kind of mammoth bone, and it doesn't leave that kind of mark on stone. And it turns out, but it was laying there with all the debris of the impacted buffalo bone. The context was very strong at Cattle Guard. So it turned out, as often is the case, is that we were both a little bit right, and we were both a little bit wrong. And I was right in that those marks did relate to the bone cracking process, but he was right that it's not bone on stone doing it. What it actually is, when you break through, it's you clump down with the stone on stone. So it is stone on stone making the pecking, but it does occur during the bone cracking process. And so you see on the lower rung of tools, those are 3 of the hammerstone anvils that have been refitted. And with the arrows pointing to a place on the landscape that if the bone were preserved and you didn't have the hammerstone anvil tools, what you do actually find there looks like many other of the household areas that we have. About 4 to 6 new projectile points made, nearly equal numbers of those being discarded in the same locality, bits of red ochre, and a suite of tools. But with the bone overlay on top of it and the hammerstone anvils, what you see is what I think is late in the occupation. They're gathering up those bones that hadn't yet been cracked and doing a mass cracking of it. In this part of the site, once they do that work, it's just left as it is. And either they abandoned the site at that time or simply abandoned that part of the site at that time. But they weren't tromping and moving in and out of that area once that particular work was done. I think that might have happened once the meat was dry and those hides that they were taking are in a rawhide form. Once you make rawhide, that's as light as the hide's ever going to be during tanning. And at that stage, you have options once you've stabilized it. And you can roll it up and take it somewhere else to work on. And what I think they might be doing is using those as expedient containers to haul the meat out of there, to take to another location. Where, as David was saying, after you do all that work, he thinks that, and with the predators on the landscape, that it's quite likely you might move somewhere else closer to the streams and better places to do brain tanning than cattle guard might have been. Here's one of these bone cracking tools. Each of these pieces is refitted and was found during the initial detachment from that tool in that northern cluster right there. If you look carefully, you can see the pecking on the lower part of that tool, and you'll observe as you look in the earlier pieces that came off that they're not similarly pecked. And because of the nature of shingling, of what overlies what else, that's how we're determining what came off first, second, and third, along with that kind of modification. And then that tool was used in this location, near that house, and then it was used again and abandoned in K2. And you see a similar pattern here, a first use down by that household, next use at the next household area to the north, and then used in that mass processing area and abandoned there. Again, you see this, early use down here by the household, additional use, and then breakage at that point. And the largest remaining piece they had that was backed along the edge that's closest to me, they kept. And we found that having that unifacial bit end on that is really an added plus in bone cracking. They refurbished that tool and continued to use it, and then again it was discarded with many of those others. The Chukchi in Siberia, I read an account that's where I got the term bone cracking equipment, that's what they call it. The female head of household is the one sort of in charge of making sure it's available for the family, but it's in no way a gendered tool, but she sort of covers that for the family. And I've thought about using it for a head count, sort of. I don't know if you really can do that for Folsom, but like you've been asking the questions, and we ask, how many people does this represent? We're trying to do it with Folsom points. We're trying to do it with meat. We're trying to do it with hammerstone anvils. We're trying to do it with structures, and, it's not easy to get at. And then use and abandonment. Now I'd like to look a little bigger scale for a moment and look at the landscape from which they're drawing their tool stone and where they're living before they come into the San Luis Valley for that hunt. There are two suites, geographic suites, as I think of them, of raw materials at cattle guard. This suite south of the site includes Edwards and Alabates, which is not unusual in the San Luis Valley. It occurs in low numbers but consistently. It's at Linger and Zapata and Redden and other Folsom localities in the valley. And then Chusca material from over on Navajo Nation's lands. And a material that we've called, the name was given by the folks that work out of the Pagosa district who took us up to see this quarry that they call Mosca. And it's up at 10,000 feet. I kept reading in reports something they said that looked like Alabates. It's Alabates-like. And I asked them, I said, do you know where that Alabates-like stuff's coming from? So they took me up there, and sure enough, it does look like that, but it looks like lesser varieties of Alabates, but there is Alabates that looks like this. But when you go up there, there's a lot of material that looks like that there. And they're bringing small amounts of that into cattle guard as well. There's quite a bit of this material that we've named Cumbres because the first place we found it in primary context is near Cumbres Pass, near the New Mexico border. It's a raw material that is a siliceous material moving through thermally hot waters that then silicifies. And it has structures within it highly recognizable. I love this during analysis because you can have a flake that's half the size of your little fingernail and you can identify it positively as Cumbres. We have very few materials for where that's true. But this one, because of the crystals that grow in place, it's highly recognizable. And it's used, Dan Emick described it, down in the sites down into New Mexico all the way to the Tularosa Basin, probably beyond. And then that beautiful veined dendritic jasper that is known as Trout Creek, and there are lookalikes for that. I don't know that all the material that's dendritic in our country comes from Trout Creek, but some of it, I think, clearly does come from Trout Creek. So you have that material, and then the next material but next to it, which is actually Bob Patton was kind enough to show to me, and occurs on Folsom sites up around Hartselle. And we have that at cattle guard as well. And then you have these beautiful woods that are coming out near Elizabeth, Colorado, the Black Forest Woods. Formerly, millions of years ago, they were palm trees before they turned into stone and were used to hunt Folsom bison, which I think is marvelous. There are also woods in South Park, and I spoke recently with Susan Bender because to relook at that. And all the ones that they've shown me so far, none of them are of the quality of some of the woods that we have that look like dead ringers for what's coming out near Elizabeth. But we have other woods that could well be coming out of South Park. And so that whole issue that they did a lot of XRF work, but it was sort of a bust. She didn't advise us to go that direction. So we're still wrestling with trying to understand our raw materials as are other people. This material is a hornfels, and one of the places that it occurs in the northwest part of the valley near Cochito Pass near Sawash. And it's in small amounts in the valley, including that one ultra-thin biface that broke. And there's a flint knapping area of it on the site where I think that particular knife might well have been made. Bruce Bradley went through the debitage with me, and there's diving flakes in there that looked like that probably was from ultra-thin manufacture. We've been trying to refit to that tool, and we haven't been successful. But I think the smart money is that sooner or later we've had, everybody comes to the lab, we take that box and put them in front of them. It's like a jigsaw puzzle, And because I really think it'll pop sooner or later. Another thing that I'm doing right now, more carefully than has been done previously at Cattle Guard, and that is to really track through where the different types of raw material are distributed across the site. We've looked at it before, but now that all of the tools from the site are scanned, I can make scans in all different ways very, very quickly at the desk right now, and so it's just a marvelous analytical tool to have that. So I was up there late at night, and I threw out the Edwards. I'd seen it before. I'd seen it in numbers. I knew it on the database. It was intellectually in my head that it was up there, but there's something about having that visual in front of me when I can actually see it. What portions of the Folsom base, not just Folsom base, that it was a corner ear, probably came in with meat, this sort of thing. But this is all, with the exception of the utilized flake I already showed you at the lower right, and a spoke shave from the surface for which there's no provenience. This is all of the Edwards and Alabates at Cattle Guard, yet you can see it's preferentially distributed to that northern part of the camp. So I'm trying to look at these things right now, trying to see what kind of leverage it'll give us to understand social groupings, if they existed in the camp. Because when, for a while in the beginning, I looked at all these different raw materials and tried to make an annual round of going from the San Juan Basin into South Park and Elizabeth, even if people dispersed during part of that time. Bringing them together and then bringing them all in for the kill never worked. And it didn't work because I don't think it happened. When you look at each one of these raw material types by their attrition pattern for the projectile points, for the end scrapers, for the gravers, each raw material type together and then pulling them all together, they each one have their personality that makes a lot of sense. Like there's a lot less Chusca distance from quarry. It's still there in a lot of the various tool class categories, but the way that it's worked down has a certain distance from quarry complexion to it. And then you see them, those folks from the south are hitting the Cumbres quarry. It's the last big toolstone gear up they're doing from the south. And I think they're doing likewise when they're coming in from the north. So pretty much I think the evidence is fairly good for an aggregation site for Folsom at Cattle Guard. And so this just sort of will show you once again the suites of raw materials from the kill, from the work area, which might also be a residential area, from the area where I think we have a structure in the outdoor activity area that goes with it, another household activity area, the area where they did so much of the mass processing of buffalo bone, and then again, red ochre, hammerstone anvil tools, the fragments that have come out off of it. At each one of the clusters, these are larger K-means clusters, but before that, within each one of those were two smaller clusters that you would see from density contouring. And in each one of those, there was either 4, 5, or 6 new projectile points made that you could account for by minimum number nodule analysis, and about equal numbers of that made. So it gives you some idea of the amount of repair going on in these households. This is a map that has not actually been updated in a few years. We have more sites than this, but it still gives you an idea. These are a distribution of Folsom sites in yellow and Clovis in pink. The yellow dots with black dots within them are sites, more substantial sites. The others are localities where maybe you found 1 to 3 Folsom points on the surface. And then the blue for late Paleo-Indian. Where the yellow dot is here, I'd like to take you upslope for a moment and look at the headwaters of the Rio Grande, where we also worked on a beautiful Folsom site known as the Black Mountain site. It's up at 10,200 feet in about 4 miles away from where this picture is taken. This is the drainage of North Clear Creek, and then it's on the road that goes over Lake City into the Gunnison. And this is an aerial view of Bedrock Knoll, that on the non-creek side of that knoll, we've done test excavations of Folsom material. Very different kind of assemblage from cattle guard. It looks to all the world to me like an upland male hunting camp. And I'm not suggesting in any way that the women are up in the mountain in the season. I just don't see a lot of evidence that they're at this particular site at this particular time. And it looks like there's reoccupation there. It's the kind of sites that you've seen Jack Hoffman and others describe as at overlook locations. That's the kind of assemblage that's found here. It's buried 25 centimeters below the surface. There's no bone preserved here, but there are preserved hearths, and we got radiocarbon dates. We have 25 radiocarbon dates from the top of the surface down through the Younger Dryas and the Folsom deposits at this locality. While we were there, along with that, I worked with a friend, now Dr. Reasoner, to pull a pollen core from Head Lake. Mort Turner helped identify, a glacial geologist helped identify an appropriate lake for us. On the other side of the mountain from Black Mountain itself, where we have 19 radiocarbon ages, and back in 2000, we actually had some of the best dates for the beginning and end of the Younger Dryas that existed at that time in the Southern Rockies. I would like to thank Mr. Redden that you see with Dennis in the smaller inset photo, and Bob Bunker and Eddie Clayton, who've been dear friends to us and have shared their knowledge of the San Luis Valley. Bob Bunker was the foreman on what's now Nature Conservancy lands for 40 years, hunting elk all of that time, herding cattle, marvelous, generous man. Many people have gone to him and studied his collections, including students of Jack Hoffman's right now. And I think that one of the best measures that for myself of what's going on in the San Luis Valley is Bob Bunker's collection. Very, very extensive collection. And Folsom overwhelmingly dominates the Paleo-Indian in that collection. It's 12 Clovis points and hundreds of Folsom points. And I think that's a pretty fair representation of what's out there, certainly on the east side of the valleys. Mostly worked on the east, but some on the west as well. And I'd also like to thank Nadine, because she took time with me when we were both working on that film. And at that time, I had begun work with a number of elders who kind of stuck with me over time, which I've appreciated. And she was the one that impressed upon me that as a mature woman, that I was a crazy lady to be traveling without ochres and white, black, and red and yellow minerals in my purse. And so there we were in Holiday Inn, and she was almost like, I'll show you mine if you show me yours, in the sweetest way after we gotten to know each other. And I was saying, well, I have red ochres, but I didn't bring them. And it taught me so much, just the expression on her face. In part, it was like, oh, you poor woman, in a sense. And then also she was very kind because she truly worried for me. And she said, well, we don't leave without protection. And it was the beginning of what is a big part of my work, which is I love the sense of humor. I love the company of Native people, and I spent a lot of time there. So I've actually been away from archaeology a little bit because I've been spending so much time in this company learning, and now I've come back to Paleo-Indian with it, which was always my intention to do. I see it as another form of sort of graduate school. So thank you for your attention, and that's all I have.